Κωνσταντίνε, ξεκινάμε.
Ναι, έτοιμη.
Ωραία. Dear colleagues, dear specialists from the Aegean and Cyprus, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Urania Kouka, and in my capacity as Deputy Director of the oldest research unit of the University of Cyprus, I welcome you to the third lecture of the 62nd public lecture series of the Archaeological Research Unit, our ARU. I would like to welcome our tonight's speaker, Maud Devolder, Professor at the Department of Archaeology at the University of Ghent, Belgium, and warmly thank her for accepting the invitation by our good colleague, Professor Apostolos Aris, and the Archaeological Research Unit to hold a lecture at our institution. Before giving the floor to Professor Devolder, please allow me a short introduction to her background, research, and academic career. Maud Devolder has studied at the Department of History of Art, Archaeology and Musicology of the Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium, by Professor Jan Driessen and Joachim Brettschneider, well known in Cretan and Cypriot archaeology, and received 2 MA degrees from the same department. One in art history and archaeology with an MA titled Human Energy Investment in Architecture, the Minoan Palace of Gournia, and one in Eastern Mediterranean archaeology with a thesis on domestic architecture and social distribution in Rashamra, Ugarit. In 2009, she has obtained her doctor title from the same university with a PhD about social components and interactions in Neopalatial Crete, an investigation of the archaeological data. After the completion of her studies, a long postdoctoral, very interesting journey, thanks to 11 prestigious grants, has started for her, with main stops at the French School at Athens, at the Humboldt Universität Berlin. She has cooperated at the well-known project Topoi, in Louvain-la-Neuve with a Gerda Henkel postdoctoral fellow, at Rethymnon with an Onassis Research Scholarship, at Bristol with the Warren Fellowship, and Venice with the Caringi Fellowship. In 2022, she became a professor in archaeology of the Aegean world in Ghent University. In the same year, she obtained a prestigious ERC Consolidator grant for a research project entitled Daedalus, Conceptualizing Processes of Monumental Architectural Creation in the Eastern Mediterranean Bronze Age. Daedalus explores her twofold interest for ancient architecture and societies. Besides the ongoing ERC project, she is the director of the study and publication of the excavations of the palace at Malia. Besides, she is the principal investigator of the project Ceramic Synchronisms in the Bronze Age Crete. Her fieldwork experience does not include only Malia. She has participated in excavations on Crete, at Palekastron, Sisi, Anavlohos, Dreros, in Attica, Thorikos, and also she worked in study seasons at Malia, Myrtos Pyrgos, Knossos, Petras, Festos, the big sanctuary at Iuktas, Agriana, and on mainland Greece at the stone quarries at Delphi. Maud's research interests include, as you have already understood, Aegean architecture, genesis and development of Minoan palaces, early states formation, ashlar architecture in the Eastern Mediterranean from the Bronze Age to the Hellenistic period, or even to the Roman period. On these topics, she has widely published. So far, 3 peer-reviewed monographs as sole or main author, 1 co-edited volume, and about 50 papers in peer-reviewed journals and volumes. She has widely communicated her expertise in conferences organized by herself or others, and has held numerous guest lectures across Europe. Tonight, we're having the honor and pleasure to listen to her lecture about Mason's marks and their meaning for the development of monumental architecture and the circulation of builders in the Bronze Age, Aegean, and Cyprus. Dear Maud, welcome, and the floor is yours. You can share your screen.
Thank you very much. It was a very kind introduction. So I'm sharing now. Can you see that? Okay.
Yes, of course.
Super, thank you. So thank you for the very, very kind introduction, for inviting me. So I thank all the other department and also Apostolos and well, everybody there. So today the topic of my lecture is Mason's marks and their meaning for the development of monumental architecture and the circulation of builders in the Bronze Age Aegean and Cyprus. The generic term Mason's marks refers to a large corpus of pictographic signs carved on the surface of building blocks or other stone elements used in architecturally elaborate edifices dated from the 19th to the 13th century BC in the Aegean, and from the 14th to the 12th century BC in Cyprus. The signs consist of linear patterns, and they are categorized into 23 types, the most common of which are the bras levés, the cross, the branch, the star, the double axe, and the trident. Some of these types are divided into subtypes, and combinations of signs, called ligatures, are common. Strokes or oblique lines, generally cut in groups of 3 or 2, form an additional type, which is almost exclusively found at Akrotiri on the Cycladic island of Thera. The Mason's marks occupy a special place in the history of the Aegean, and especially Minoan archaeology. The first examples were brought to light by Minos Kalokerinos, who launched the excavations of the palace at Knossos in 1878. Kalokerinos was a Cretan lawyer and very active man of letters, who often escorted eminent visitors around the site. Amongst these fortunate guests, the US consul in Crete, William James Stillman, visited the site on several occasions. And in the letters telling of his travels, which were published in 1881, Stillman mentions the characters inscribed on the walls uncovered at Knossos, which he interprets as possible hieroglyphs, or as indications for the builders, or as keys for the threading of passages. Stillman's publication of the marks discovered by Kalokerinos played a decisive role in what was to become Minoan archaeology. It attracted the attention of Arthur Evans, one of whose quests was to discover the primitive writing of the Homeric period. Evans had already been intrigued by seal stones inscribed with pictographic and linear signs, which he tracked down in the shops of Athenian antiquarians who claimed Crete as their source. The marks discovered on the walls at Knossos encouraged him to travel to the island, where he made several trips in search for sites and evidence of what he called in his 1894 travel diary, some conventionalized system of picture writing. Despite Evans' initial enthusiasm, analogies between the signs carved as Mason's marks and those of contemporary writing systems later proved to be few. Only a handful of parallels exist between the 23 categories of signs represented by the Mason's marks and the signs of the Cretan hieroglyphic and linear A scripts: arrow, cross, crossed arms, branch, double axe, door, dumbbell, and the snake. Because of this limited overlap with the scripts, the Bronze Age Aegean Mason's marks are treated as a separate, non-scribal system of signs. I must emphasize from the very outset that Mason's marks in the Bronze Age Aegean differ from the positioning, setting, or assembly marks made by craftspeople for placing cut stone blocks in the masonry, to facilitate the alignment and declivity of the walls, or to set floors and roof lines, and which are, for example, well documented in dynastic Egypt. The Bronze Age Aegean masons marks discussed here form an altogether distinctive corpus of signs, the function of which remains debated. About 2,500 masons marks were identified in the Bronze Age Aegean. An overwhelming part of this corpus is to be found in Crete, where the carving of the marks spans from the middle Minoan 1b to the late Minoan 1b phase, that is from the 19th to the end of the 15th century BC. Similarly, the carving of masons marks in the Cyclades and mainland Greece occurred during the Middle Cycladic III, Late Cycladic I, and Late Helladic II phases, that is during the 17th, 16th, and early 15th century BC. All examples of masons marks found in later Cretan, Helladic, or Cycladic structures appear on reused blocks. This is, for example, the case for several marks on blocks reused in walls dated to the Mycenaean period on Crete at Knossos. For example, the Kephala Tolos tomb or in the Isopata royal tomb, built in the late Minoan II phase. For broken horns of consecrations, marked with a branch and a trident sign incorporated in a late Minoan III wall at Archanes Troulos, and at Malia, where two marked blocks were taken from the destroyed Minoan palace to be reused in the late Minoan II entry oblique building and epsilon quarter. It is also the case for the block bearing a mason's mark representing a double axe reused in the Roman fortification wall at Colonna on Aegina, and for the 6 blocks marked with the signs of the trident, branch, and cross, reused in the wall surrounding the mound for the treasury of Atreus at Mycenae, or found near the citadel wall. I want to insist on how important it is to distinguish between the date of the carving of the marks and the date of the use and reuse of a marked block, because wherever this distinction can be made and definitive evidence pertaining to their date is available, the mason's marks are only Middle and early late Bronze Age in date, and they are never carved after the late Minoan I and late Helladic II phases, that is, after the end of the 15th century. Having set the chronological framework, I must present the geographical area in which mason's marks were used. I have mentioned so far examples in Crete, the Greek mainland, and Cycladic and other islands on the Aegean, but so-called mason's marks have also been reported on Cyprus. A handful of signs carved on ashlar blocks in buildings at Alassa, Maroni, Hala Sultan Teke, Kuklia Paleopaphos, Kalavasos Aios Dimitrios, and Kition were identified and published as mason's marks. These have been used in arguing for architectural connections between the Aegean and Cyprus, and for the possibility that Aegean builders participated in Cypriot building projects. However, if one looks carefully at the Cypriot evidence, marks referred to in publications as mason's marks on most Bronze Age Cypriot sites are actually setting or positioning marks, including pry holes for moving cut blocks in position, or random signs carved on various objects. In other terms, although these Cypriot marks were indeed carved by masons or stone cutters to help in the building process, they are not mason's marks in the way the term is used in the Bronze Age Aegean. Only 4 possible examples that appear not to be positioning or random marks were carved on blocks inserted in late Cypriot 3B walls of temples 4 and 5 and of Temenos B at Kition, at the end of the 12th or beginning of the 11th century, some of which may perhaps be reused from earlier late Cypriot 3A structures of the 12th century BC on the site. This is more than 2 centuries after mason's marks had stopped being carved in the Aegean, and it is worth underlining that the carved signs at Kition are signs CM23 and CM25 of the Cypro-Minoan script, and that Caroline Barnes has identified CM23 on various supports at the site, where she argues that it may have held a special significance. So not only are there very few Bronze Age Cypriot marks that match the Aegean practice, but even a handful of examples at Kition are very late in comparison with their Aegean counterparts, and they seem to have held a distinctive purpose. This has important implications on Aegean and Cypriot connections, especially when discussing the flourishing of ashlar architecture on Cyprus. Out of the 2,500 masons marks that formed the Bronze Age Aegean corpus, less than 20 were identified on quarry surfaces, and less than 5 were carved on fixed or portable objects with an evident or almost indisputable religious purpose. The rest were carved on blocks incorporated as building components in ashlar walls, in these walls' foundations and antae, and in pillars. I am insisting on these various supports because some of them have played a key role in the interpretations that were given to the mason's marks, which are mainly polarized between a ritual or magical function on one side and a practical one on the other side. The signs carved on what can be definitely identified as ritual objects are the following. There is an incurved shaped ashlar bearing the signs of the cross and star, discovered in a sanctuary in the south wing of the Malia palace. Besides its incurved shape, typical for Minoan altars, it was found together with 2 clay feet for a wooden xoanon and 4 tubular and 3 tripod foot vases used for incense burning. All these objects were found trapped in the late Minoan 1A destruction layer of the palace. Another marked ritual object is the pyramidal stone base for a double axe, which bears a mark that represents the branch sign. It was discovered in room 10 of the Middle Minoan 3, late Minoan 1 palatial building at Archanes Turkogitonia. Unfortunately, I was not able to find an illustration of it. There are also the horns of consecration bearing a branch sign and a branch and trident ligature, broken and reused in a late Minoan 3 wall at Archanes Troulos. And one must also note the suggestion that a block marked with a star found in the peak sanctuary of Iuktas, south of Knossos, may have served as a base for a pair of horns of consecration. So these certain or possible marked ritual objects are generally put forward by the supporters of a religious or magical purpose to the mason's marks. The first and perhaps keenest proponent of such a purpose was Arthur Evans, who, 1 year into his own excavations of the Knossos Palace, published a seminal paper in which he associated the marking of pillar blocks to the worship of a divinity variously embodied in sacred trees, pillars, or stones. To provide support for his view, he drew parallels with other religions and other material cultures, but he also argued for the ritual nature of the carving on some pillars in the Knossos Palace of the sign of the double axe, which he associated with the Cretan Zeus. Later finds, most prominently in a marked altar from the Malia Palace, would provide further evidence for a religious purpose of the marks because, to quote Yannis Sakelarakis, stone cutters would never dare to scratch their mark upon a cult object. Many scholars acknowledge the religious nature of the ritual stone objects bearing mason's marks, but they hesitate to extend the religious purpose to all mason's marks based on so few examples. Instead, they remain convinced that the vast majority of the signs were carved in order to identify teams of builders. The main argument for a practical function of the marks is analogy with other societies, since marks were carved in dynastic Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the early Iron Age in the Near East, and in medieval and modern Europe by warriors, stonecutters, masons, and contractors, so that they could obtain retribution for their work. Another argument for a practical purpose of the marks, put forward by Jan Begg in 2004, is the clustering of types of signs in the Knossos Palace. The double axe on the west wall of the Hall of the Double Axes, the arrow in the grand staircase, the trident in the north entrance passage, and the croix pommée, the double axe, the star and the gate clustered in separate sets of rooms in the western magazines. According to Begg, signs of the same type are clustered in areas that are architecturally unified and distinct from one another, a fact that can only be explained if each one of these areas was built by one single team that left its own trademark. If each one of these areas, surprisingly, never or almost never is the discussion for a practical purpose of the mason's marks based on a detailed analysis of the interrelation between the marks and the blocks upon which they were carved. Mason's marks were carved on hard stones in exceptional instances. There is one very recently discovered and published marked granodiorite block at Stelida on Naxos, and 2 marked hard limestone slabs at Hagia Triada on Crete. In all other cases, the marks appear on blocks shaped in rocks such as porous limestone, sandstone, coarse and fine crystallized gypsum, and to a lesser extent at Akrotiri on ignimbrite, dacitic tuff, and porous lava. These rocks are homogeneous in composition, and the building components made of them must be procured with what is called the separation or channel extraction technique. It is distinct from the fracturing technique, where the stone component is detached from the bedrock using the natural fractural lines, which naturally occur in harder rocks. The separation technique used for producing the marked blocks was more time-consuming, and it required expert quarriers, but it had the advantage that the dimensions of the blocks were not limited to the fracturing lines so common in harder rocks. Mason's marks measure between 3.5 and 72 centimeters, but most are between 10 and 30 centimeters in size. They were carved using a metal pick, chisel, or point, and while some marks are boldly or deeply carved onto the surface of the stone, others are shallow and very finely cut. The characteristics of the carving have been used by Sinclair-Hood to categorize the marks at Knossos into a chronological sequence. He expanded Arthur Evans' tripartite chronological divisions of the marks into 5 A, B, C, D, and E classes. These range from large and deep-cut marks carved with a pick or punch and wooden mallet to fine and shallow marks carved with a chisel. Taking into consideration the reuse of the blocks upon which they were carved, Hood asserted that the marks that are large, boldly, and deeply cut tend to be earlier than smaller, finer, and shallower marks, and he associated each class with a specific phase or phases of the relative Minoan chronology. Considering the very complex architectural history of the Knossos Palace, from its construction around 1900 BC until its final destruction around 1350 BC, this chronological sequencing of the marks is a godsend, and it has been used by several archaeologists to anchor specific walls or areas of the Knossos Palace in the Minoan chronology. Unfortunately, this sequencing is not necessarily valid on other sites. Mason's marks identified on the sandstone blocks that form the walls of the Malia Palace, for example, do not fit this chronological framework. At Malia, the palace, which may have been built as early as the Middle Minoan 1A phase, shows no indication for the marking of blocks in the MM1B, MM2A, and MM2B phases of the Proto-Palatial period. Only after the Middle Minoan 3B phase are marks carved on the blocks of the second or new palace. And in this Neo-Palatial palace, both deep and shallow marks are cut on the sandstone blocks extracted and used during what appears to be one same building project. The key arguments for a unitary building project are structural connections between the walls and shared configuration lines. This Neo-Palatial palace integrates in some places standing Proto-Palatial remains, most notably in the western and eastern magazines, but it is by and large an entirely new program. A novelty in this second, new or Neo-Palatial palace at Malia is the extensive use of sandstone, a material procured in quarries spread along the shore north of the Malia settlement, from Stalida to the west to Sisi to the east. These Neo-Palatial sandstone blocks bear marks that represent 9 out of the 23 types of signs known at Knossos. The oblique building constructed in late Minoan II in the middle of the north court of the palace, many blocks of which bear fine and shallow marks, is often taken as evidence that at Malia, fine shallow marks are later in date, just as suggested by Evans and Hood for Knossos. But this late Minoan II oblique building reuses blocks of the Neo-Palatial palace, more precisely blocks from the east and west walls of the northwest court, which had been destroyed in late Minoan 1A. If one looks in details at the carving of the marks on the blocks of the Malia Palace, A pattern emerges that is different from the chronological framework produced for Knossos. At Malia, out of the 135 cut sandstone blocks that bear mason's marks, most are still in their initial position in the walls. Since the construction of the new palace appears to be a unitary building project, the paleographic characteristics of the marks cannot have had a chronological value. Instead, at Malia, there is an almost perfect fit between the depth or shallowness of the mark and the surface of the block upon which it is carved. As I already mentioned, in the Bronze Age Aegean, blocks in soft stones were extracted using the separation or channel extraction technique. Channels were cut around the block of the desired dimensions, and the lower face of the block was separated from the bedrock through pry levering. The blocks extracted through the extraction channel technique thus have a regular shape, and they can be incorporated in the walls without being worked. These regularly extracted but undressed blocks are what one calls raw blocks or raw extraction blocks. But the extracted blocks can also be dressed or cut, and this to various degrees. Some blocks only have their upper and or lower face roughly worked, most often to be used in foundations or in leveling courses. These are called rough blocks, where tool marks can be visible, but the worked surface remains quite uneven. And other blocks show carefully dressed surfaces. The common trend in Minoan architecture especially is to limit the careful dressing of the blocks to the visible outer face, while the contact surfaces between blocks are only partly or roughly cut. These cases show that the blocks that we generally call ashlar blocks or cut stone blocks are not always carefully dressed. So going back to the marks carved on the blocks of the Malia Palace and taking into account these variations in the degree of processing of cut stone blocks, it is striking that 95% of the deep marks were carved on the uncut or roughly cut surfaces of the blocks, almost always on the upper or lower face. And 93% of the shallow marks were carved on the carefully dressed outer surface of the blocks. If one looks even more carefully at deeply carved marks, it is also striking that 40% of them are carved on raw extraction blocks, those blocks that were left entirely unworked after they had been procured in the quarry. So in the Malia Palace, the characteristics of the mason's marks seem to be compatible with the practical purpose of the marks, where the marks indicate the production of separate teams involved in different stages of the building process. The quarriers carved deep marks, preferentially on the top or bottom face of the quarried blocks, but also in rare cases on the side faces of the blocks, indicating that the marks were carved after the blocks had left the quarry bench. The stone cutters carved shallow marks on the outer face of the blocks they trimmed and most probably also positioned, since there is good evidence in Minoan architecture that the blocks were given their final touch already in the wall. To say it otherwise, deep or shallow marks do not reflect upon the chronology of the marks at Malia, but to teams or individuals who were involved in different stages of construction. This extraction by the quarriers and the dressing of the blocks by the stone cutters must have been acknowledged during the building project, because the marks in the Malia Palace were later hidden by other blocks in the masonry, and because the marks finally carved on the outer face of the blocks were masked behind a thin plaster coating. Plastering of ashlar is not a generalized practice in Minoan Crete, but it is recorded in the Malia Palace by the early excavators, and faint remains are still visible today on some blocks. It is suggested that because the local sandstone was so porous, it was necessary to coat and to protect it. It is worth pointing out that in the Malia Palace, fine shallow branch marks carved by stone cutters are clustered in the eastern wall of the northwest court, as if the stone cutters of the branch team had been allocated the construction of the walls in this specific area of the palace. In contrast, the scattered distribution of the different types of deeply carved marks in the building indicates that quarrying teams did not produce blocks for specific parts of the Malia Palace. The sandstone blocks were extracted in different quarries along the Malia shore, so it would have been more efficient to carve the marks at the quarry site and to count the blocks bearing each mark once they had reached the construction site. So the production of each quarrying team could then be easily assessed and the workers be remunerated accordingly. After the blocks had been counted, they were distributed in the building and dressed, when necessary, to fit specific walls, which would explain why the deep marks on some blocks were partly destroyed during the shaping. There is an interesting illustration of this process with a raw extraction block bearing a deep trident mark on its upper surface. After the trident mark had been carved, the masons tried to cut the block in order to produce two smaller elongated blocks. But they abandoned the idea, probably because the cut blocks would have been too narrow on one of their sides, and this would create load-bearing issues. The Malia Palace is an interesting case because the study of its marks is way easier to manage than on a building like the palace at Knossos. There are way less marks, the chronological sequence of the building is way easier to grasp, and there is significantly less reuse of marked blocks. This state of things has been very helpful in analyzing the relationship between the marks and the blocks that support them, and to come to the conclusion that deeply or shallowly carved signs at Malia reflect the stages of construction during which the blocks were marked. Having the data from Malia in mind, I want to go back to the palace at Knossos, more specifically to a comment made by Sinclair Hood in his publication of the Knossos Masons' marks, because he observes that, and I quote him here, the earliest signs at Knossos are found cut on what were the original upper and lower surfaces of the blocks, as well as on their sides, while the latest ones are virtually confined to the dressed phases of blocks of ashlar masonry. If one takes out the chronological value he assigns at Knossos to the depth or shallowness of the marks, Hood's observation fits perfectly what we have just seen in Malia. To test the possibility for a practical and non-chronological value of the marks using Hood's catalog of the Masons' marks at Knossos, I looked in details into 301 marks of the Knossos Palace, so about a quarter of the catalogued entries published in 2020. Out of these 301 catalog entries, I had to leave aside the marks that had been recorded by Arthur Evans, but were no longer visible for Sinclair Hood to describe in details, and I also left aside the possible duplicates. This left 222 cataloged marks from the Knossos Palace, which I processed taking into account the class assigned by Hood to each of them, the surface upon which they were carved, and whether this surface was dressed or not, and to what extent. This rapid processing shows that there is indeed a very strong 95% match between Hood's classes of marks A, B, and B, and uneven or entirely irregular upper, lower, and in some cases back and side phases. And another very strong 90% match between outer, finely dressed surfaces of the blocks and the marks assigned to classes C, D, and E. So what I mean is that in the Knossos Palace, we have basically the same pattern as in Malia. Deep and bold marks carved mostly on the upper, lower, irregular surfaces of the blocks, and fine, shallow marks mostly carved on the outer, dressed face of the blocks. One could still argue, if one were to maintain a chronological value for the paleographic characteristics of the mark at Knossos, that builders on this site marked different surfaces of the blocks in different periods, but this does not match at all the pattern that we have in Malia, where it is obvious that the marks were carved during the same building project. It is worth mentioning that in the sample of Mason's marks I processed for the Knossos Palace, only Mason's marks of the A to B classes, so the deepest, the oldest marks, had been partly destroyed by the shaping of the blocks, which suggests that, just as it was the case in Malia, the deep marks had been carved before the blocks were shaped and thus have no chronological value. A quick overview of Mason's marks visible in situ or illustrated in publications or online elsewhere on Crete seems to support the same pattern. Unfortunately, the publication of Mason's marks is often limited to the type of signs, with only rarely information pertaining to the characteristics of their carving and the surface upon which they were carved. There is fortunately much to be expected from the forthcoming publication of the marks from the Festos Palace by Nicola Cucuzza and Marta Pestarino and their collaborators. At Festos, Luigi Pernier at first agreed with the chronological classification of the marks, but he later pointed out that it did not match exactly the record. The final publication of the Festos marks will provide the second largest corpus in the Aegean after Knossos, and it will be interesting to see if there, the characteristics of the signs and the blocks they were carved upon supports the identification of teams of builders involved in the quarrying and dressing of the ashlar blocks. Now, there is one significant aspect of the record that does not fit a purely functional interpretation of the mason's marks, namely cut stone blocks bearing multiple marks, mostly 2, and in rarer instances 3 or 4. Such blocks represent more than 1/10 of the marked blocks in the palace at Knossos, many of which have shallow marks carved in almost all cases on the same outer and well-dressed face of the block. This repeated marking of some blocks by the stone cutters is especially strong in the walls that compose the most architecturally elaborate areas of the Knossos Palace: the court of the distaffs, the hall of the colonnades, the grand staircase, the hall of the double axes, and the area of the Queen's Megaron. While a utilitarian purpose related to the construction process may be demonstrated for many masons' marks, the repetitive, almost obsessive carving of the same sign on some walls and pillars may hint at more than the need for builders to get their work acknowledged by the project's commissioners. The largest cut sandstone block in the palace at Malia seems to provide another illustration of the awe inspired by elaborate masonries. Its upper surface shows a carved ligature of a star combined with an arrow and a linear A inscription, a unique occurrence that suggests a special purpose. The inscription may have functioned as an incantation for protecting the stone from the moment it was procured until its setting into the palace walls, unless it commemorates the outstanding accomplishment represented by the making of such a large, carefully dressed block. Still in the Malia Palace, it is striking to notice that the only blocks that show marks deeply carved on their outer face are those that make up the pillars of the so-called pillar crypt. This room is located in an area of the palace where mason's marks are especially scarce, and a large variety of the types of signs that have appeared on the walls of the building are concentrated here, as if the builders were especially keen to carve their own signs on its walls and pillars. These examples seem to blur the distinction between a purely practical or religious purpose to the mason's marks. But you have to keep in mind the fact that where there is sufficient information to analyze the relation between a mason's mark and its block, the by far largest part of the record fits a practical function related to the acknowledgement of teams of builders involved in different stages of the building process. Whether multiple marks at Knossos and the carving of an inscription on the Malia block assumed a magical function or expressed pride in workmanship, I think there is sufficient evidence to suggest that such non-practical function remains secondary to the identification of teams of builders. A detailed review of the published evidence shows that an overwhelming proportion of the mason's marks were discovered at Knossos, with 1,678 catalogued examples. On the palatial sites of Festos, Galatas, and Malia, the numbers are significantly lower, with 247, about 160, and 143 marks, respectively. On other palatial and non-palatial sites on Crete, the numbers of marks range from 1 to 42. Knossos not only produced the by far largest number of marks, it also gives us some of the oldest marks, as well as the most diversified typology of signs. The extensive archaeological exploration of Minoan buildings incorporating cut stone masonry on this site has been put forward for explaining the staggering number of masons' marks recorded there. But the distribution of the marks on other extensively excavated sites suggests that the breadth of archaeological exploration is not the main reason for the overrepresentation of Knossos on this distribution map. It is indeed worth noting that Knossos is the only palatial site where marks appear so extensively outside the palace itself, with more than 300 marks identified in elite buildings on or near the Kefala hill. At Festos, at Malia, at Galatas, at Petras and Gournia, where structures of all periods were excavated around the palaces, the signs carved on blocks found in their initial position in the walls appear exclusively or almost exclusively within the Neopalatial palaces themselves. The Katozakros is an interesting exception, with a third of the site's 21 marked blocks found outside the palace, although some of these might be reused. At Malia, the marked blocks found outside the palace were reused, or in 2 cases, stolen from the palace construction site. Sinclair Hood had pointed out that the use of masons' marks outside the palace within the town of Knossos is a neopalatial feature, so that they are carved when elaborate, so-called palatial and elite architecture flourishes at Knossos and on the rest of the island. In a paper published in 1990 already, Jan Driessen had used cutstone masonry and masons' marks, together with other elements such as spire and door partitions, frescoes, minoan halls, lustral basins, stilobats, and porticos, as an indication for the proliferation in Neopalatial Crete of the palatial architectural style. He pointed out the high frequency of these architectural features in the Knossos area and along the south and east coasts of the island. And he suggested that the marks were indicative of traveling guilds of masons who conveyed a palatial style that had first emerged in north-central Crete and proliferated all over the island and beyond. The practical function of the marks I argue for in this presentation, based on the revision of the marked blocks at Malia and of the evidence recently published at Knossos, set in perspective with a broader record on Crete, supports the hypothesis that the marks indeed represented itinerant teams of builders. This hypothesis is further corroborated by the setting in perspective of masons' marks with the development of ashlar on specific sites. At Malia, the use in the Neopalatial Palace of cut stone blocks bearing masons' marks is contemporary with the introduction of new ways of building in cut stone. Cut sandstone was already used in several proto-palatial edifices at Malia, namely in Quartier Mu, in the hypostyle crypt, in the descent building, and in the Sanctuaire aux Cornes. In these proto-palatial edifices, ashlar was used only in limited quantities and in very diverse forms. Rough extraction blocks in the descent building, where sandstone elements may have formed the base for vertical timber supports incorporated in the rubble masonry, roughly worked blocks making up one-faced thick mortared ashlar walls in underground rooms in the hypostyle crypt, and the carefully dressed true ashlar blocks in Quartier Mu. In contrast, the characteristics of the marked blocks in the Neopalatial Palace at Malia, often set in rubble-backed masonry and sometimes supported by a cut stone leveling course in shell wall masonry, are new to the site, and they mirror the characteristics of growingly uniform cut stone building practices on the island, best exemplified in north-central Crete. Perhaps more strikingly, several of the cut sandstone masonries of the Neopalatial Palace at Malia show indications pointing to the incorporation in the wall of a timber framework. These are identified by the presence of mortise holes, the rabbited band sometimes visible on the upper surface of the blocks, and the voids left in the masonry by the now disintegrated wooden elements. There is no indisputable protopalatial precedent at Malia for the association of timber and cut stone masonry, but in a series of detailed studies on the use of timber on several Minoan sites, and following suggestions made by Cléry Palivou, Eleftheria Tsakanikate-Ochari has illustrated the development at Knossos of an earthquake-resistant timber framework with horizontal elements incorporated at window and door height into cut stone masonries, which unite walls in a common horizontal timber zone. So at Malia, the combined evidence pertaining to the appearance of new types of ashlar masonries, the use of masons' marks, and the association of timber and ashlar in the Neopalatial palace point, I think, to the participation to the building project of stone masons originating from Knossos or north-central Crete. Again, one may argue that the architectural prominence of Neopalatial Knossos is largely due to the extensive archaeological exploration on the site, but one must insist on the concentration of the marks in the palaces themselves, in palatial sites away from Knossos. The chronology of the second or Neopalatial palaces also supports the circulation of north-central Cretan stone masons. At Knossos, the palace is rebuilt after a destruction in MM3A, while many palaces on the island are built or rebuilt after MM3B, or even as late as the late Minoan 1B phase. There is admittedly a need to further refine the dating of the appearance of specific cutstone masonry types on the different sites, but present evidence strongly supports the idea that Knossos was a precursor and a major player in the incorporation of marked ashlar blocks in the elaborate cutstone masonries so typical of elite Neopalatial architecture on the island. The possibility that Knossos had developed in the Neopalatial period into a large territorial state, its larger population, and thus potentially larger specialized workforce and clientele, may explain the greater use of ashlar masonry and the extensive finding of masons' marks outside of the palace. Similarly, it is possible that in north-central Crete, the specialized labor pool was sufficient for wealthy private owners to commission the best stone quarriers, stone cutters, and masons present locally, while on more distant palatial sites, access to the most qualified, in this case itinerant craftspeople, was restricted to the commissioners of the palaces. But while this workforce was mainly involved in palatial building projects, outliers do appear. The carving of masons' marks outside the palaces, including on non-palatial sites, suggests that there was no strict control of specialized builders by palatial elites, further confirming a recurring trend in Minoan architecture regarding the fluidity between the different categories of building types and architectural features. Outside Crete, masons' marks are strikingly few. Akrotiri on the island of Thera is a notable exception, with 68 carved signs in the late Bronze Age settlement, thoroughly catalogued and published by Erika Notti. The sign of the cross, carved on 28 blocks at Akrotiri, is regularly attested on Crete, but the sets of strokes or oblique lines carved on 24 blocks discovered on the site are extremely rare outside Thera, perhaps pointing to a distinctive group of local stone quarriers. Importantly, Cléry Palievou suggested that marks at Akrotiri were perhaps related to the shaping and general dimensions of the stones, the strokes in sets of 2 or 3 for elongated blocks, and the crosses for cubic ones, which would indicate indeed a distinctive practice on Thera. In the Peloponnese and on Egina, the types of signs are identical to those found in Bronze Age Crete, and they were carved on structures dated to the 16th and early 15th century BC, where information related to their date is available. So when available, the dates make it possible for these specific marks to have been carved by Minoan builders, a suggestion that fits current evidence pertaining to the appearance of cutstone masonry in mainland Greece. Recent detailed and synthetic studies suggest the presence in southwestern mainland Greece of Minoan masons whose technical knowledge merged with local building traditions to answer local architectural needs. And it is tempting to interpret the mason's mark carved on orthostat blocks in late Helladic 2A walls in the palace at Pylos and the late Helladic 2A Tholos tomb at Peristeria as the illustration of this Minoan presence. Unfortunately, the marked blocks at Mycenae in the Argolid and Colonna on Egina were found loose or reused in later walls. So it is very tempting, but impossible to confirm whether they indicate Minoan masons, and I would say Cnossian masons, traveling to the northeastern Peloponnese. One must, however, insist on the fact that no mason's mark is attested in its original use in walls dated to the Mycenaean palatial period or during the 14th and 13th century BC in mainland Greece. Similarly, it is worth considering the scarcity of mason's marks in Cyprus in the light of the flourishing of ashlar masonry on the island in the late 14th and the 13th century BC. That is well after Minoan cultural predominance in the Aegean Sea had been supplanted. I do not deny that there was some architectural influx from the Aegean, as indicated, for example, by Nick Blackwell, who pointed out the presence of Cretan tools in the 13th century BC on Cyprus. However, the lack of mason's marks in the Cypriot architectural record indicates an architectural pattern that is distinct from the Aegean. To summarize and conclude, I hope that I have convinced you of the opportunities that arise from studying the mason's marks together with the characteristics of the blocks they were carved upon. In the record I have tried to analyze here, this approach challenges the religious magical interpretation of the marks, but also their chronological value, and instead supports their function as markers of building teams who traveled on and perhaps even beyond the island of Crete. Of course, we lose a formidable dating tool, but I think this approach can really contribute to our understanding of the ways in which cutstone masonry flourished in Minoan Crete and beyond it, and to the discussion on the social, economic, and political processes associated with this flourishing. The first mason's marks were discovered by Kalogerinos almost 150 years ago. But with the ongoing discovery of new examples, detailed recent and forthcoming publications of long-discovered marks, and a new, less purely paleographic and more encompassing approach of the marks and their support, this category of material still has a lot to offer to the Bronze Age Aegean archaeologist. I thank you for your attention. I want to stop sharing, I think.
Okay. We thank you very much, Maud, for this magnificent presentation of the so far available corpus of mason's marks. I mean, it's very impressive, the work you have undertaken, and I think everyone was very impressed by the presentation, the analysis, and the spatial and temporal context, the presentation of spatial and temporal context of mason's marks. Among the audience, there are specialists on Minoan archaeology and on Cypriot archaeology who may have already excavated buildings with mason's marks. I suppose that they can contribute to the discussion, and we would be very pleased if you could answer to whatever question comes from the audience.
I can try.
Yeah, thank